Okay, everybody. So we got a reaction right now, just to bring you guys up to speed. It was brought to my attention that this topic of Magic Find was brought up in this podcast here with Subtractum, Captain Lance, and Palsteron, all three of which are lukewarm towards the idea of Magic Find at best. And I found out that they had a little bit of a back and forth, kind of an interesting debate here. I guess it was kind of like Jonathan was sort of pushing back against some of the things they were saying about the future of Magic Find and PoE, whether it's PoE 1 or 2. So I wanted to react to this. Genuine reaction. I've not seen any of this content yet. I just heard that it's in here. And I always like the topic of magic finding. It seems to be the most debatable topic. One of them in PoE. So let's see what they have to say, and I'll make some comments along the way. Hopefully I can bring some good value here.
So next I'd like to pick your brain a little bit about a pretty contentious topic in the PoE community right now, which is Magic Find.
Sure.
And you've already stated that it will be in PoE 2, albeit in simpler form. And it will be on items as well. Now, I don't represent the whole community here. This is, like I said, a very contentious topic, very split between the different factions. But in terms of what I dislike about the idea, it would be, for example, that it's a weird sort of concoction where you remove power from your character in order to get more items, which kind of feels a little bit antithetical to the whole ARPG power fantasy, I guess, if you would call it like that. And at the same time, you also have this weird dynamic where your builds kind of become just these farming machines. You kind of tune them just to be farming machines for like a currency per hour, where you say, I'm going to sacrifice this gear slot, this gear slot, this gear slot, or this suffix. I think you said you wanted on rares now and not on uniques anymore, if I remember correctly. The new MF set. But basically,
uniques.
Or did that change?
Well, uniques. Well, nothing has really changed about that. Just to clarify, there are certain slots that have Magic Find on your character that res can get it, and then there are uniques that have Magic Find.
Especially if we're talking about Quant, I love the idea of shifting Magic Find in general over to rare items as opposed to uniques, and so we don't have to be pigeonholed into things like gold worms, for example,
as well. But I mean, it's just a question of really a balance of like what, you know, we're making sure that the slots that we put it on are well considered and so on. But I understand, right? Like, so I definitely understand. So there are definitely people on the design team as well who kind of there is the same faction split that happens. Like, some people like it, some people don't.
I didn't know that.
I do think it's something that we could discuss again. But what it comes down to, I mean, the argument for it really comes down to the idea that it's another thing to optimize for your character once you've already beaten the ability to kill a boss, right? Because there's only so high the content can scale in the end. Because I mean, the argument on the for side of like why we shouldn't have Magic Find is that if damage is the only scaling that you can do on your character, then that means that the way you scale Magic Find is by scaling the level of content you can do, and it's a fair argument, right? Like, I do understand that, but like, there's really only, if we don't have Magic Find, there's really only two things you can scale up your character: the defenses and the damage. And
okay, I mean, I couldn't agree more with Jonathan here. This is the grand argument that I've always made when it comes to Magic Find, is it is sort of in essence, in terms of mapping and raw farming for raw loot, it is essentially the pinnacle of gearing your character, because you've already over-geared the content to such a degree, there's nothing left to do to make you can't increase your killing power. The power fantasy is basically maxed out. You can't become any more powerful, at least in respect to how efficient your character's running the maps. The only thing to do at that point is to become more efficient at looting, like getting loot to drop, which is for Magic Find. Palsteron earlier said, was referring to the power fantasy. I've always said there's two fundamental ways of looking at this game, either through the power fantasy or the loot fantasy. And a lot of people in my community play the game for like the dopamine hits with the loot. That's where it's at. And so they're always looking at it from that angle. And if you look at it from the loot fantasy angle, you're way more likely to be warm to the idea of Magic Find. If you're looking at it strictly at the power fantasy level, you're way more likely to be, lukewarm at best towards magic find on gear because you really don't like the idea of sacrificing power in a power fantasy game just to get more loot. So it depends on where you're at on that continuum. Not everybody is Stark, on the loot side. Not everybody's on the power side. Some people right in between, and it does create for an interesting dynamic. And I think that's where, if you think about where you're at, where you are at on that spectrum will help you identify kind of how you feel about Magic Find by and large.
And having that third axis is really the main reason we want to do that, because there's not very many axes it can be on your character, so that is the argument. I guess because it's so factionalized, like the two factions here, it's very hard for me to necessarily push the conversation one way or the other. Like, people know the things about it, but all I can really do is just summarize the feelings. I would say that I might be willing to be persuaded on this one, so it kind of comes down to where we end up. But it's definitely a topic worth coming up again. As I said, certain developers on the team very much on one side, certain developers very much on the other side.
Salmer Priest here, you asking how do I feel about the economic pressure in non-Magic Finders and Magic Find? I don't see it as a big deal, especially when there's almost infinite different strategies you can do, and many of which involve league-specific drops or deterministic drops that have nothing to do with Magic Find on gear. There's actually very little, in the grand scheme of things, very little of actual loot that's dropped is through raw drops, or very little of valuable loot that's dropped is through raw drops. I would say the majority of things that you drop that are of value, that, if you think about all player wide, every single possible strategy you can do, most of that is through specific drops. For example, harvest juice or harbinger shards, or anything related to Legion, whether it's from the boxes or the incubators or things like that, or delirium rewards, things like that. All of that has nothing to do with Magic Find.
I don't really want more to add to the conversation other than that. But as I said, I don't know that I necessarily feel too strongly on one side or the other. But so therefore, I guess we'll go with what the most developers here kind of feel happy with, and that really is just the extra scaling axis is important.
Yeah, for sure. The way I kind of feel it's a problem anyway is that in terms of itemization, the way you represent is you have this kind of like lever that you can pull where you like remove power and you add quant, which in theory sounds nice, but what ends up happening is you have these characters with these shitty uniques that are just the same on every character, and you have a situation where, for example, maybe the endgame content is not hard enough to where you actually need to put on real gear, and now everybody just runs around with the same amount of unique gear.
Yeah, I think almost everybody is in agreement that these hyper-specific, unique pieces that are best in slot for Magic Find is not healthy for the game. I mean, even people who love Magic, even people who love having 100% quant characters, probably feel when they genuinely think about it and talk about it, yeah, that's not good. I wish it wasn't this way. I wish the best gear was a little bit more flexible in the slot and I could choose other things that would be as viable.
Or, like, even going further here, for example, an Emmy gives you 20 quant. It's like, okay, now every unique amulet and every build that revolves around that unique amulet is now basically invalidated because you're now inefficient. And sure, that's not how every casual player would approach it, but it's definitely inhibiting in terms of like making builds on your own. And that comes once again to this problem of seeing characters just as money-making machines.
Mandrill, you're saying it was way worse when quant was a suffix? So you're saying when quant was a rare piece, I mean, at least you could optimize your gear to have whatever prefixes you want and what other suffixes you want. That sounds a lot better to me than, if we're talking about, again, you use the case in point, Goldworms, 20% quant boots, 10% movement speed, 50% fire res, and that's about it. It would be nice if, I don't know, they didn't exist and you could get maybe 10% quant at the most as a suffix, and then, I don't know, get Tailwind on your boots, get Elusive, get anything, just be a lot better. It would feel a lot better.
Instead of like playing a game, right?
I do appreciate where you're coming from for sure. Like, I definitely get it. And that might come down to the individual specific balance decisions of the individual uniques. It's certainly not good if the only amulet to ever run is just one amulet. Because now effectively whatever design we put on any other amulet is irrelevant, and that's not really very good. So I guess that would imply then that we just have to really make sure that we're not going too far with the magic find on uniques. Because I guess the trade-off is less certain when you're coming down to rares, right? Because getting a good magic find rare is going to be harder. There's different.
The trade-off, yes. The trade-off, yes. You're just sacrificing a suffix instead of a whole item, but you still have the same problem where, okay, now in that slot, I would really like to use a rare, so that one stat is on my item. You have the same problem as the other way around. So it's kind of just a very hard thing to do, and it also gives us you problems in terms of endgame scaling, because now you have to exactly scale the end.
I don't agree with Palsteron here. The problem's a lot different. If you can use a rare that you have your own stats, I mean, you're sacrificing one suffix. Yes, it makes the item a lot harder to craft. At the end game, that's not going to make any difference. The only place this actually does make a difference is the decision between a magic find unique and or rare piece, if it existed, versus a build enabling unique item that doesn't have magic find on it. That's where you have to make like interesting decisions. Well, I would say interesting decisions. Some people might say annoying decisions. To me, it's an interesting decision. That would be a much better way to have the game balanced. Because then it wouldn't be, do I use the MF unique or literally anything else? Instead, it's like, do I use an optimized rare piece that has quant on it versus a build enabling unique? If I have to do that or want to use that build and maybe sacrifice that slot for a build enabling unique.
Game correctly to where it's hard enough so people can't run around with magic find gear in your hardest content. So it's also pretty hard to balance around that, and it can maybe.
So hang on. So there you were saying that you have to balance it so that people can run around with magic find gear. Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm saying that you can't make it so people can run around in the hardest content in the game with magic find gear.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
But then
that's a hard thing to balance.
Right, but then what's the alternative for that? So there's no magic find, and
the alternative to that was remove it from itemization and just have separate systems. Which, I mean, you can say anything in this game is magic find. You can say the Atlas passive tree is magic find. Right?
What I'm looking at though is like, so say you didn't have it on items, you just scale, like the only thing you're scaling then on items is defense and damage, right?
Yeah.
So
movement speed. I mean, you have other ways to increase your efficiency,
or I guess movement speed technically counts, but
speed.
The thing is
attack speed for your movement skill, right? Like stuff.
Oh my God, Palsteron's face. It was such a disconnect they had there.
There's definitely more vectors than that.
Ultimately, it comes down to damage, right? Except for movement speed doesn't, but everything else really comes down to damage. Like things like attack.
Jonathan is like so laid back here. He honestly though, in his defense, he must be kind of tired of doing these podcast videos, and they are over an hour into this one.
Speed and so on are just really another form of damage when you come right down to it.
Sure.
Yeah. So movement speed, I guess, there's an argument for it being different, sort of, but.
Yeah, I agree with Palsteron here. Movement speed is a valid stat that it's not defense, not offense, it's something else, and it's extremely powerful, and so is other things like action speed, and I don't know, I mean, anyway.
Sure, all right, but let's say you do that. So let's look at what that results in now. So basically, if the the content on the Atlas doesn't scale high enough, then you've just got extra damage that is worthless. And so what are you specializing in then? You kind of don't have another axis to invest in, right? Like if you've got too much damage, like you hit a point when there is nothing more you can do for your character. And so your character is done, if you know what I mean? Like there's nothing else to optimize.
Yeah, but what's the difference? So you just instead put on like unique items that are just making your character weaker.
Right. So now
like,
there is
what I'm saying
is there is a thing where more stats then have a use for your character. And this is what I mean. This is where the argument is, right? Effectively, that like you've got dead stats that you can't do anything with, and Magic Find gives you a way for something to be relevant, even in the case where the stats, like for damage and so on, would not be relevant anymore.
That would then be a problem with the endgame content, where it's
right.
not
so
there's not hard enough content to do anything with your gearing.
Right. So then, if you have the ability to scale your the endgame content to the highest amount of damage you could possibly scale it to. Then you start to get into the issues around
build diversity,
like having content that's like, okay, so when you've got content that only that is extremely hard to the point where only certain builds can do it, then you start to run into the situation where people will only run the builds that can do that.
Build
content.
Diversity, then yes.
This is actually the thing that I was trying to talk about before when I was talking about the in-game concerns, is that and this is a weird one, and as I said, I don't have really a solution for it, but it's like if the content is so hard that only a few builds can do it, you just lower build diversity, and that's kind of a problem too. And it may not seem like they're not exactly related to the Magic Find thing, but it sort of is a bit.
But you have the same problem in that.
He's going. That's interesting. They're going at it hard. Yeah. So this at the top end, it becomes an issue of build diversity versus having other unique ways to scale the gear. I know Palsteron's made this point before. If he was if he was a prime developer in PoE, he would make content so hard that you can't ever justify using MF gear. Or actually, he would just remove MF gear, so you didn't have to do that, and you could run, So I know that, like, in his perfect world, MF gear doesn't exist. Content is relatively difficult, but not so difficult that only a few builds can do it. So there would be a lot of different builds that could do something, and that, Magic Find would be implemented in other ways, like he mentioned earlier, the Atlas passive tree, through things like altars, Eldritch altars. Just map modifiers is fine. So yeah, I kind of get where they're going at this. I did see a comment earlier that they're both arguing good, interesting core parts, but their verbalizations on it's a little bit weak. Maybe Jonathan hasn't. He's got a lot on his plate. He obviously has to think about a lot of different things. He probably hasn't gone down the rabbit hole of thinking about Magic Find quite as much as some of us have.
Sense with Magic Find, just that the
yes,
builds are more powerful,
just
have more quantity.
Yeah. Because you end up running
the better
same
builds. They have the same. They can run the same content, but now with like 70, 80 quant. So there's the same disparity. Just because they can run it doesn't mean that the other person is not just has a huge advantage. So that's just a skill gap, right? Not skill gap. I don't know, like certain skills being better than others, right? That still factors in whether you have MF or not.
It does, but I guess what I'm saying is that the number of builds that can work, if the content doesn't scale to the point where, like.
Also, I just want to make a side point. I really appreciate the fact that Jonathan is even looking at this through the lens of an ultra endgame gearing. A lot of developers, a lot of games, and even I've noticed this in PoE, they will talk about things like this in terms of the average player or something, that you can't even have this conversation they're having in good faith unless you are looking at it through the lens of, like, not exclusively like the super endgame, but everything in between, the average player as well, all the way up to like the very top end player, because it's highly relevant at the very end game, as it intrinsically related to what do you do after you've already reached the end of the power fantasy.
Like if there's a bar that you have to clear, right, which is the top content, and most people would assume that a build, like, okay, if a build is viable, as it were, then it has to be able to clear the highest content of the game. Then if that bar is the higher that bar goes, the less builds are going to be included in it. And you could say, well, we'll just balance everything perfectly so that everything's the same. But I mean, that isn't really good either. It's like, you've got a problem. There has to be some variety going on, and like, sure, we try and do what we can, but it's not always going to be. But effectively, the harder the content goes, the harder it is to actually balance the game to make the more enough builds viable. Yeah. So that's just a random concern to have. And like, I want to really emphasize the fact here, by the way, that while I am making this argument from the side right now, like, I do appreciate the arguments for Magic Find being removed as well. Like, it is a thing that I am not unsympathetic to, right? But what I'm saying is, I'm just like looking at the different cases. Like, so in the case where Magic Find doesn't exist, I feel like what you're going to have is that if the content is very hard, I
want to do if he says what I would say. Well, the way I would complete his sentence is you're going to have a situation where the enduring enjoyment of the game is cut short. You have less to do at the very end of the game. You have less to play for, less to gear for.
As hard as it can go, so effectively you can always scale damage from Magic Find. You're going to run into the problem of the not enough build diversity, and if the content isn't hard enough, then you've got the problem of dead stats. And that may not seem like hugely compelling compared to the opposite side, which maybe it isn't, but
not judging by their
I'm just
expressions.
kind of trying to like show you like some of the considerations.
I get where you're coming from. I'm just trying to counter that point with the best skills are still going to be played just then with MF gear. It's still going to be that way.
No, well,
that was just
correct.
my point. Yeah.
So then what you're
Like
saying
tornado
then
shot
is
was
that the
for a
fact
while.
that
Tornado shot, right? Like
right. So what you're then saying is that if the best build with MF gear is still the best, then people always play that over playing another build that can't do it without with MF gear. Is that what you're saying? Which I think is
that
definitely
will
true.
always be an issue. That would
Right,
always
right.
be an
Which I
issue
definitely
with
think
how
is
hard
true.
that.
Yeah, and it's true to some extent. I agree with that. But I guess what I'm saying is there's still a possibility then for that build to be somewhat viable at in-game content, and I do think that not everyone will do that. But then also, isn't the difference between the with the factions here of like MF gear versus not MF gear? Aren't those factions also divided among the people who are choosing to play with MF gear right now and those who are choosing not to? Like clearly there are people who would choose not to do it because they're
Oh
choosing to
yeah.
right
No,
now.
I'm not like not
Right.
like just speaking for the whole.
Yeah, I chose not to wear a Simplex amulet this league because I wanted to use Yoke of Suffering, which wasn't even build enabling, but it really helped. It helped the build a lot in damage. And, I lost effectively 20% quant by making that decision. But it was a compelling decision for me to make this league, and I felt like it was worth doing since the content was hard enough. It wouldn't have made any sense to do that if it was just running tier 16s. But with the new tier 17s, it being harder, I have to somehow balance the killing efficiency, the power of the character versus the difficulty of the content. And if it is weighted in such a way where maybe I'm better off wearing less MF gear and just doing more and having more power, because I'll actually be so much faster that I'll get even more loot quicker by having less quantity on gear, for example. That is a thing, and that is what makes MF gear the most compelling as an answer to the dead stat problem that Jonathan keeps bringing up.
Community. There's definitely people who love MF. Like there's no question about that.
But look, I don't disagree that it's a conversation that we should probably have again internally, and I will have another serious conversation about this. The people who are against it, well, I mean, I know there are specific people who are against it, and I can probably.
I just wanted to pick your brain there. I just wanted to pick your brain.
But it is interesting. It isn't a conversation we've had for a little while, so it's probably worth having it again and seeing whether we still feel the same way about it. You're obviously in favor of no magic find.
I like the idea of like not being forced into certain
Sure.
gear pieces. Yeah.
And the two others on this call, what do you guys reckon?
I'm pretty indifferent about it in terms of I don't use it myself, but I don't feel it needs to be removed. I feel a lot of times, for me, PoE is all about like I want to just create something and I enjoy that, and I don't usually get pulled too much into this person's doing something really efficient. I have to be like them. Yeah. And so I don't feel as forced, but I think that happens to a lot of people.
But then when you are making a character, do you still feel the need for your build to be able to do the hardest content?
Typically that's usually my goal. I have a standard of like I want to be able to do this stuff, but I don't feel like I have to do that.
So you would be the prototypical example of a person who would run into the kind of issue I was referring to, I guess, of like if we make it so that the effective way to scale Magic Find is to scale damage by making it so that we just have like the content get harder and harder and harder to the point where like any amount of damage you can scale causes that, then you'll start to run into the issue of like you feel bad because you can't, using whatever other build you're trying to make, be able to kill the other content. Defeats the hardest content, if you know what I mean.
I typically enjoy some level of, even though it does suck when you make a build that isn't good.
Right.
For me, failure I view as usually a good thing in terms of there's a reason I made something bad. What was that? Right. What can I learn from it? And if it's really hard, then it's a big challenge. But
right, understood.
I don't know how that would feel for other people.
Right. And you, what do you reckon?
Yeah, I mean, the thing for me, I've been playing since Parandus League, and I think last league, or I played around with it just like for a couple days a few leagues ago, but basically until last league, I had never touched MF,
right?
Because I never felt compelled to.
It was a pretty funny video once. I remember it was a few leagues ago. Subtractum was all like humdrum about the state of MF gear. I think he was kind of against it, but then he like tried it first time and he modeled a character off of mine, but then he tried to do it as an occultist and he got destroyed in the maps. I remember it was I felt kind of bad. I was like, oh, you were so close to making it work. It was doing what map? I think it was Arch Nemesis League, I think, or no, sorry, Calandra League, Yeah, it was Calandra League, and he was trying to farm the Colonnade. I remember that video.
But
Yeah.
then with the wisps and everything,
Sure.
it genuinely felt really weird. And obviously this is a sense of a scale and balance and everything, but it felt really weird. And the whole game ended up get twisted. And I think this is why it's coming to a head. The whole game got twisted last league, particularly, where all you had to do was slap on the generic quant gear. You could do T7 maps, I think. I think it was T7 maps.
Yes. So now, here's the thing that I do
Right.
think is bad. I do think that it's bad whenever you can be getting more items, or more value, I should say, from playing lower level maps than higher level ones. I think that is definitely a bad thing.
Okay, I'm glad this point was brought up, and I totally agree with it. Octafint, you're saying you don't understand why Affliction loses due to the league mechanic and not MF. I mean, that's not how I'm seeing the point phrased here. I'm just seeing Subtractem bring up a point that it's generically it's an issue whenever you can, for lack of a better word, artificially lower the difficulty of the content, but still get incredibly rewarded for it, which is ended up being what happened. It was definitely an imbalance in terms of difficulty and reward. I also think it's kind of bad for the game whenever you can still get like incredibly rewarded with gear and T7s than that you did. Granted, you couldn't get the Eldritch Altars or Valdos boxes in Tier 17, but yeah, it was kind of an issue.
But that I think was more of an issue with the league than it was with the MF gear as such. Like it was that's definitely a problem. So I definitely don't like that, and I want to avoid that at all costs. Like it should always be advantageous to do higher level content, as far as getting wealth is concerned.
Yeah. But yeah, it's still, even I eventually did scale it up into T16s. Like I even took my little SRS Guardian that was just supposed to be like a comfy quality life build, and I slapped MF gear on it, and I was dropping, tens and tens of divines per map basically. And any build that you wanted to make last league, and I think that this is the big issue for like the build creators like Palsteron, right? It was like any build last league, the number one question is like, how do I fit Magic Find into this gear? And it turned into like, as you were saying, like the third vector by which everyone wanted to judge every build is like, okay, yeah, damage and defense. That's like a solved thing. How do I get Magic Find into this build? Because it's the only thing I care about. And it felt like oppressive from a build making perspective.
Well, that can certainly imply that there's a problem there as far as balance goes. Like if that's a thing where that is the only goal that you would have.
I agree. That's a good point from Subtractem, but that was an Affliction specific thing. And I actually do think that Affliction caused people to think that way. That it's basically just rewarding it as how do we deal with the FOMO of Magic Find when it's so high on a league for which the league mechanic rewards raw drops and Magic Find so much that you just feel like it's the be-all, end-all. Like it matters even more than the defenses and offenses. I definitely don't think that we should ever reach a point where Magic Find matters more than defenses and offenses. When I first came onto the scene, I was a hybrid Magic Find builder. Compared to what true MFers were doing, as it were, I over-prioritized defenses, especially defenses and offenses, and consequently ran maps with less Magic Find than a lot of players. And I actually gained some popularity and notoriety because of that, because it was kind of a new way of looking at Magic Find, where you could still have feel like you had an overpowered character with quant and rarity on it still. It was a nice blend of it. It worked really well since the diminished returns that exist on Magic Find too. But yeah, I definitely think last league there was so much FOMO about any build you made. You wanted to have Magic Find on it as much as possible because of the league mechanic and how it was balanced.
That's a concern, right? I get it. And I mean, like, it's very interesting just talking to some to players about this more, I think, because yeah, like as I said, it is an issue I think that is worth discussing again. So yeah, I'm going to talk to people at studio again and reevaluate my feelings about this. Because I guess we're sort of defaulting into how it should work. Like, okay, it has been discussed for PoE2 in recent times, but usually speaking, the standard reasons for it to exist come out again, and we just kind of like, oh yeah, this is what we do. I don't think we've had a serious like, okay, how about if we just actually remove this? Let's see what we get, and let's really go through it again. Discussion until like recently. So I'll bring it up again. I already know exactly where the lines will be drawn as far as the design team is concerned. So then we'll just have another. We'll have another. We'll have another argument about it, and that might be.
And just to add to this, it's definitely a different problem in different leagues. Like the league mechanics play a huge role in how it actually plays out. So it's not the same amount of problem in every league. But if it crops up again and again, and it's kind of like it reduces design space, that's still like a thing to consider, right?
Yeah, no, for sure.
Yeah.
I think I need to understand more about why it's been more of a problem recently, like the exact triggers of that. Because my previous understanding of geez, I always forget the names of everything. The Forest League. What the hell was that called?
Affliction.
Yeah, Affliction.
Yeah.
What?
That league in particular had a problem where the rewards and the difficulty were not in line. And that is what I believe led to the problems that we had where you could play lower tier maps and get more rewards that way. So I believe that was the league mechanic responsible for that due to not having that aligned correctly. So it might be that it is just that and we just need to avoid that, or it might be that there's a deeper issue, because I assume that your people are feeling that way this league also. And I'm not like immediately aware of what it is about this league that would cause that as such. So there's something about this perhaps that I don't understand. And I probably need to understand what that is to be able to be able to work on this problem. Because like if you
shift the whole discussion to this, but
right. Because the thing is, like, why is this an issue now? Why was this not an issue 4 years ago? You know, like there has to be something going on that's led to that.
That's an interesting point. I think it's actually, it's my fault, guys. It's all my fault. I popularized MF too much. It's because we've blown the lid on magic finding. It used to be this, this deep dark secret in the ugly recesses of the hyper niche PoE community that did magic finding, like tier 4 map magic finding, Saint's Treasure in the precinct map. With enraged strongboxes. Now the whole lid has been blown out. Oh man, my bad, guys. It's my fault. I'm being exposed.
Obviously, it's different from league to league, but this has always been kind of like creeping up. But it was never like in the light as much as it was recently.
But you say creeping up, and it's like, what is it about it that's been creeping up? Like, what changes have been happening that caused this to creep?
I think it's also that.
You know what I think my honest answer to that is been too much power creep in the game. The game's gotten too easy. It's gotten so easy that everybody's starting to turn. People are getting better and better at the game in general, and they're starting to research different things. And yes, more Magic Find related content is making its way out onto YouTube and the forefront of the community. And yeah, we've had some setbacks, like since I played in Ultimatum League, Expedition League, Calandra League, with some setbacks in player power. But overall, I mean, just looking at the total power creep we have from Ultimatum League when I started to now, especially if you exclude tier 17 maps, if you exclude them, then my characters are way more powerful. I don't know, I might be a little biased because I'm certainly better at the game than I was the first few leagues that I played, but yeah, I think people are just looking for ways to extend their enjoyment in the game, and Magic Find, as Subtractive said, the third vector of gearing, the process of gearing your character, involves stripping your power away and putting Magic Find gear on. And more people are going for that.
Okay, this is a little bit more like further away, but there's a lot more fragments nowadays that you use for maps, for example. So I remember back in the day, like Legacy League, I think it was 2.6, kind of popped that off with like League Stones, I think they were called back then.
Is this the end of the Magic Find conversation? For those of you who watched the video already?
Yeah.
Where you guys were kind of testing like scarabs that are now basically scarabs, and other things like sextants. And I think that the problem was also that those are per map. So now would you...
Okay. All right, thanks for letting me know. Okay, so I guess in conclusion, what I got out of that was hyper-specific unique gear with Magic Find stats is bad for the game. Everybody agrees with that for the most part. Affliction League, in particular, really put Magic Find to the forefront. Whether you think Affliction League was the problem or not, that is what's really gotten this conversation going in a major way. And it made it so that people who favor build creation, people who like the power fantasy of the game, which are usually people who like creating builds, they sort of felt under the gun to have to convert their build, whatever it was, to a Magic Find variant of the build. Obviously, I love doing that. I kind of do that by default, but I'm an exception to this rule. Most people making build don't do that and have no interest in doing that. In fact, I know for a fact Subtractem, Lance, and Palsteron are all three avid power players, meaning they love making builds to accomplish certain goals with the power fantasy in mind at the forefront of the purpose of playing the game. That's how they play the game. They're very on that continuum. They're pretty far on the end of the power fantasy, whereas again, I'm an exception because I'm kind of over on the other side of loot fantasy. And I think we all have kind of echo chambers. Most of my viewership leans pretty heavily on the loot fantasy side of things, and most of their viewership leans pretty heavily on the power fantasy side of things. But you just have to reconcile the fact that there's many different kinds of players, and the evidence that there's a lot of players on the loot fantasy side of the thing is the fact that this topic keeps getting brought up more and more and more and more, and even the power fantasy players are having to contend with it more and more, and they don't like it. Naturally, they don't like it. So I'm trying to present this in as unbiased way as possible. But anyway, yeah, cool conversation point. I didn't realize it was mainly just Palsteron and Jonathan going back and forth. I know Palsteron in particular hates MF with a passion. He and I get very well along. I love talking to Palsteron in general, and he's got a great stream. And I sometimes hang out in his stream too, even though it's a Magic Find haters paradise, for lack of a better phrase. But that's going to be it. I hope you enjoyed the little reaction. Oh yeah, and definitely subscribe, view it, like it, all that. I guess this came from Subtractem's channel, so it's his podcast that Jonathan's on. Jonathan did sure look a little tired for this one, and I get the impression he might be a little bit tired of this topic. He keeps saying he's going to go back to the drawing board, talk to his people about it. He doesn't sound all that serious about that. I don't know. But I think we already know Quant gear is not going to be a thing in PoE 2. Only rarity gear, and it'll be on rares, I think. And hopefully other versions of Magic Find can be embedded into the game, like they already are on monsters with the number of monster modifiers, the map modifiers, things like that. So anyway, there we go.